This is the first draft of the history of the overreaction to COVID-19 in Britain. Up to that Friday, with the chief medical officer and the chief scientific officer and the prime minister himself, the good sense of the scientists and the statisticians on the one hand, and particularly Boris Johnson's libertarianism and generally, looking on the bright side, the pot half full rather than the pot half empty, we were going to go along with what Sweden has done. We were going to go along with what Sweden has done. We were going to go along with what was demonized as herd immunity, but which would have resulted in things like social distancing, a suggestion that people observed extra special hygiene and that sort of thing, but not this gigantic lockdown. But what happened that weekend? And this, Peter, is how history is made. We tend to think of history as being gradual. Yeah. Usually history is a crisis. Things turn on a pin's head. And in that weekend, three things happen. And the first is that the deaths, they're running at about 20 or 30. They double. That looks dramatic. The second thing that happens is the nemesis of Britain, France, President Macron of France, threatens to close the frontier if Britain did not adopt the same kind of extreme measures which France had done. And the third, but those two things are public knowledge. The third thing is private information from a journalist friend of mine who is exceedingly well informed. And on the Sunday, at Northwick Park Hospital in northwest London, one of the areas that has been of the capital that throughout has been worst afflicted by the virus, there were scenes that were reminiscent of what was happening in Italy and what was happening in Spain. The hospital looked as though it was going to be overwhelmed. The IC unit was, shutting down. There weren't enough ventilators. There were people piling up in admissions. There was, some bodies beginning to collide with incoming patients. And I think at that point, the government simply panics. And a few days later, you get Neil Ferguson's absurd report from Imperial College suggesting 500,000 deaths. And I think the combination of that localized panic and these gigantic figures suddenly landing on their deaths produces a complete change of approach. But there's another factor, Peter, that we've got to put in. There is a necessary local political factor. If we go back, the kind introduction that you gave about my last interview with you, and indeed, more precisely, I suppose, the Smith Lecture, I was talking about the new compact, the new one nation Toryism, the way that Boris has revived Disraeli. Now, part of that compact, in other words, reuniting the South with the North, part of that compact is that the Tories had to present themselves as absolutely the party of the NHS. This had always been the Achilles heel. It had been the thing that Labour had been used to get at them. If you're going to take over as Blue Labour in the North, you've got to be beyond doubt committed to the NHS. Yep. So the manifesto did that. Now, look suddenly at what's happening. On the evening of the 15th, it looks as though the headlines in 2 days' time are going to be NHS overwhelmed under Tories. That is the key issue. And if you look at what was then done, we focused all the time. You began talking about lockdown. But that wasn't really the important thing that happened in the aftermath of that weekend. It really wasn't. And again, as you can see from Sweden, lockdown doesn't make very much difference. The thing that was peculiar, the thing that was odd in Britain, were the measures that were taken. And here my information does not extend. Future historians will have to determine who took the steps that I'm going to describe now. Because the steps that were decided were to protect the face of the NHS at all costs.
Right.
And the decisions are as follows. The first is you stop all forms of surgery and diagnostic testing completely. Cancer, heart disease, the lot. the National Health Service becomes the National COVID Service.
Right.
Secondly, you clear every bed that you can so that you can deal with the expected influx of COVID patients. This is when, of course, patients, usually elderly, the so-called bed blockers, very well have had COVID-19, get sent back to care homes. And so it's this series of astonishing clinical decisions, which of course are coupled with something else. You also shut down dentistry. Astonishing. You shut down all private medicine. You do a deal with the private hospitals. You close them down. And the result of this, of course, is that Britain was spared that humiliation. We did not have the scenes that were in Italy. We did not have the scenes that were in Spain. But there is a terrible price to pay, because we've got two other sets of deaths which are now catching up. They're the deaths of the people who should have been treated for cancer, who should have been treated for heart disease, who are also terrified to go to hospital because of COVID-19 and therefore are dying in droves. And then there is the final sting in the tail. As the deaths go down in hospitals, they go up in care homes, because why are we so casual, Peter, about care homes? Because they're not part of the NHS. They're not covered by that magic label. So you see, there's a terrible, as I said, there's an awful sting in the tail that one of the things that's happened throughout this crisis is that joke, it's a Nigel Lawson joke about the NHS being the nearest thing in Britain to a national religion. It's actually come true.
Yes,
we see popular observances. We see nurses being hailed as angels. We see we've stopped doing anything on Sunday. The Church of England has shut itself down. Instead, everybody gathers outside and claps for carers. But it's a false religion. We have, in order to, it just, the way the NHS has behaved, and this is really going to get everybody very cross, the NHS behaved exactly in the way that the Catholic Church did under the threat of child abuse.
Right.
In other words, it tried to protect the institution, not the patient.
That, all of those things notwithstanding, we should have stayed on the same track as Sweden has? That's what we should be doing now?
Of course, because what is going to happen, Peter, is eventually every country will have roughly the same level of mortality unless they continue to seal themselves off. It's all very well being smug in New Zealand, but unless New Zealand keeps its frontier closed, I'm sorry. Viruses don't respect frontiers. So it's not only going to be that. I think it's another issue, which is the ignoring that the only way that you can have serious structures of healthcare is because you have serious economies. Repeatedly, we've been told, especially by the soft-headed left, that, we mustn't prioritize the economy over health or over deaths. But it isn't. You've got to maintain the balance between the two. And the Swedish approach perfectly maintains the balance between economic rationality and a degree of respect for human life and all the rest of it.